Well, I'm really excited to have this conversation. I feel we've had a lot of these conversations and very like bite-sized pieces whenever we've seen each other, but I think a bit more of a detailed and in-depth
Mm.
conversation will be, well, very interesting for me, but also for the listeners. So, Kamran Matin, you are an associate professor of international relations at Sussex University, where you teach, I believe, international history, international theory, Middle East politics, and your current research focuses on international historical sociology. I think you also call yourself a historical sociologist, and you're the author of Recasting Iranian Modernity, International Relations and Social Change. I think it's an incredible book for people to understand. I suppose, in a way, a non-mainstream analysis of the 1979 Iranian revolution, some of the factors that may have been involved in that, some of the histories leading up to it, and obviously its impacts that it has on the region and perhaps even the world today. You also co-edited Historical Sociology and World History, Uneven and Combined Development over the Longue Durée, and Palgrave's Minorities in the West Asia and North Africa series. You write a lot of op-eds and have a lot of TV appearances, particularly on Kurdish and Iranian politics. And I was very interested and very not surprised, but kind of almost surprised to learn that you trained as a medical laboratory technician in Iran and then moved to social sciences, which I feel like in a way it's almost like quite a Kurdish journey, but we can get a bit more into that
Yeah.
in a bit. So you've described how witnessing the revolution as an adolescent. I think you were 9 years old when the 1979 revolution happened, where secular, and particularly in Kurdistan, where secular left and nationalist politics, in a way, dominated, and it left you puzzled by its theocratic outcome, especially at the time. And you also have spoken about how your siblings were leftist activists who were persecuted by the very revolution that they enthusiastically
Mhm.
joined, and Kurdistan itself resisted the Islamic Republic for years, and obviously, as we know, particularly in the last few years, continues to do so. Now, decades later, you're talking about, analyzing, thinking about these events from Sussex, where you also teach. How does that adolescent who lived through those contradictions speak to the theorist you've become? And does distant, I suppose, both temporal and geographical, help you complicate your understanding?
Yeah, thank you, Elif. Thanks for making this interview possible to talk to a broader audience about these issues. So, yeah, I mean, looking back at those formative years, I think um, exile is a very complicated condition, and while it's so difficult in personal and emotional level, but I think the distance it creates between you and your kind of life environment is quite crucial in enabling different ways of understanding and um, and explaining. I came across this quote the other day by Kierkegaard, who says, life can be understood only backward, but lived forward. Um, you know People might kind of take issues with the formulation, but I think there is something about hindsight, and especially about how you revisit events after you have learned more, especially conceptually and theoretically, which is really relevant here. So I think I feel I have a better understanding of what happened then. But I would also say that if I had written that book today, that the book you mentioned was 2013, which was my doctoral thesis. It would be slightly, or maybe not so slightly different if I wrote it today. But nevertheless, I think the main thing for me was to deal with this puzzle which is faced by most leftists in Iran, and I would imagine elsewhere, about the form or appearance or I don't know, the nature of the political structures which came out of a revolution at towards the end of the 20th century, which took this religious form, because all theories of modern history and revolution, including Marxist ones, foresaw or foresee, probably still some of them at least, a kind of progressive secularization of society and politics. And what happened in Iran was completely counter to those expectations. And what particularly bothered me at the time was that, coming from a leftist environment and family, the responses which Iranian left provided, including Kurdish left, was even for the very young me was inadequate, because it was all about the religious elite or the people around Khomeini were able to abduct or take hostage the revolution and take it a different path. So there was no theorization. It was basically a quite contingent explanation in terms of particular political resources different parties to the revolution had. So that was really the origin of my interest in the revolution and explaining it. But in the course of that, of course, I realized the issue is not so much about Iranian exceptionalism as is often mentioned, but the theory with which we understood revolution, or the theories with which we understood revolution or studied it, were not adequate, because such puzzles actually abound in modern history. Russian Revolution happened in the most backward, country of Europe. Marx used to call peasants in 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, says that peasants of a sack of potato, they cannot represent themselves. And yet one of the largest revolutions of the 20th century was Chinese Revolution, which is defined as a peasant revolution. And many Marxists would consider it as a kind of oxymoron, how peasants can be revolutionary. So, and then it turns out that even French Revolution, as the classical revolution of modernity, was not really a bourgeois revolution in the Marxist sense. So when I was putting all these things together, it turned out that, well, the problem of Iranian revolution is just one instance of a much longer history of theoretical and explanatory problems Marxist scholarship has been facing. And from then on, I have been working with this idea of uneven and combined development, which you mentioned. And because it's a slightly long phrase, we often say UCD. So I hope I can also use that shorthand to refer to it. So UCD has become this broad orientational sort of perspective for me, which was useful not only in terms of understanding Iran's experience of revolution and modernity, but also the questions of nationalism, which has been my more recent kind of line of research, but as well as kind of more radical projects coming out of wider national movements, especially in Kurdistan, not to mention, particularly the Rojava Revolution, the ideas of democratic confederalism, Xinjiang Azadi, woman life freedom in Rojhelat, bursting into the scene a couple of years ago. And throughout the theme which runs through all of these events is that somehow social context, which appear to be least hospitable or fertile for these radical ideas and projects, producing them, because historically Marxists, and I'm just focusing on Marxists because that's the tradition I come from, but actually these observations apply to liberal tradition as well. So there is always this notion of some sort of correspondence between level of social and economic development and level of cultural and political sort of development. So just as socialist revolution in a broadly peasant country in Russia in 1917 was a strange thing to happen. Similarly, to have a radical feminist revolution in a place like Rojava, which is the periphery of a peripheral country in a world system. And I think for me, you know, the analytical element of these events are as important as the normative one. I want to understand how we can make sense of these apparent paradoxes. And UCD has been very helpful in that sense because it has enabled me and people who obviously work with it that we should never actually try to understand a particular event by reference to the immediate empirical context of that event itself, because the world is a world of multiplicity of societies and political formations, and the interaction between those formations and political structures constantly enters into definition and the constitution of each instance of these societies itself. So just to give an example, I think, just as Iranian revolution would be unthinkable without the impact of Russian revolution on the Iranian left, as well as, the 1953 coup by the British and the Americans, you could say the same thing about the Kurdish movement. We wrote a few years ago a piece with a friend or a colleague on the Republic of Kurdistan, or Mahabad Republic. And what we found was the incredible way in which a series of different ideas were incubated in this particular geography because of its geographical location. So, Mahabad in Roshalat was close to the Ottoman Empire. So all the Kurdish, radical Kurdish movement arising mid-19th century in Ottoman Empire were impacting the Kurds in that Roshalat. Simultaneously, the proximity to Russia, exposed those intellectuals to Bolshevism. And at the same time, liberal intellectuals in Tehran were exposed to French revolutionary tradition and so on. So all these trends came into confluence in a particular time and place and producing a very distinct kind of discourse and politics. So I think I should stop there because I could go on forever, but I'm sure you will have more questions, which allows me to explain these matters more.
I think for me, I've been reading and engaging with some of your work, well, for a while, but obviously in particular in preparation for our conversation. And I think we'll definitely have a chance to speak a bit more about the theoretical foundations and its ramifications for understanding, I suppose revolution, change, transformation, and so on. And I think one of the interesting things, for example, when I was reading a while ago about the Haitian Revolution, was some of the analysis that if it wasn't for some of the development and actually instability in the imperial core, in that case, France, Paris, that the Haitian Revolution may not have been possible in the same way, meaning that there needed to be a factor or a development or some material shift in that case elsewhere, of course, connected to also make it happen. But before we get into that, the other question that I wanted to ask was, talking about and thinking about all this, I think for me, what kind of threads it all together is I suppose, commitment to possibilities, and hearing about, understanding revolutions in looking at immediate material conditions is, I guess to say the least, incomplete. And, I think a lot of people who knew and thought about Kurdistan, particularly a lot of Kurdish people, there was this, I suppose, semi-joke, but also understanding that Rojava would have been like one of the last places that the revolution would happen, or it would be almost as as a consequence of the liberation of of other parts of Kurdistan. But, in the last, decade and a half, that's obviously seemingly been reversed. And I want to talk a bit about, or I want to hear your thoughts a bit about, therefore, I've also heard certain revolutionaries, movements talk about revolution as an invitation to madness. or like a level of delusionality. So you need to be able to imagine something beyond your immediate material condition and reality to be able to achieve something. And therefore, like, imagine the possibilities that seem far away in current material conditions. I also want to add a little bit about, because I know you're very interested in poetry. How do you think like some of those perhaps intellectual exercises and the how, the inclusion of poetry or a fiction can actually like help that?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because only this morning I had this urge to translate from Rafiq Sabir, who is one of my favorite Kurdish poets, and I just posted it so people will see it. But in terms of these, if you like, utopianism as a sort of revolutionary practice, I think what I have been trying to express in some of my work, especially on Rojava, but more broadly Kurdistan, is that uneven and combined development UCD in an interesting way, I would say productive way, sort of both theorizes this condition of, if you like, a political imagination which is in excess of its material container. But at the same time, it also issues a caution against the degree or against the limit of this utopianism being kind of materialized. And if I, you know, if I'm allowed to explain a bit more, I think the point is that precisely because that multiplicity of societies, each of which are in different levels of quote unquote development, they have different geographies, different ecologies, different cultures, different cosmologies, and so on and so forth. We are in a world of difference, and yet the elements that constitute the difference are not isolated from each other. They are interacting. So what, I mean, if I push the sort of argument forward, is that while analytically we are able to distinguish between different spaces. So Rojava is, when I say Rojava, or we say Rojava, we can think of a very determinate space and geography. For the analytical purposes, we can make these distinctions, but really, in a large-scale historical sense, what is Rojava is simultaneously is also about what happens elsewhere, but it congeals in a particular space. So in that sense, UCD says that, okay, it doesn't really matter if Russia in 1917 was only 10% industrialized, or Rojava had the least developed economy or society of wider Syria, not least because of Arabization and sort of fascist policies of the Ba'ath, because revolutionary and radical thought which have developed elsewhere can travel and of course be mediated in the course of their journey by local again, quote unquote, intellectuals like Öcalan, like others, who and those societies do not have to wait centuries, or they do not have to go through the same century-long process which have given rise to those ideas. So, I mean, because the Russian Revolution is in time far from us, I think it's easier to explain these things rather than with reference to the events which are still unfolding. So in Russia, Trotsky was arguing that, okay, Russia is not industrialized, and yet, a proletarian radical thought has already developed in the countries where capitalism has been in place for centuries, Britain, more recently Germany. And those thoughts, those ideas are not like bound to their space. They are coming. And he was not saying that this is it's a voluntaristic process. He would say that his argument was that this small working class in Russia, the proletariat which the state has created, is in a condition that it's so dire and so oppressive, that they are actually open to the most radical ideas available at the time, even though their kind of economic base, to use the Marxist jargon, was not, at the same level of development which corresponds to that kind of revolutionary ideas. So the combination of these two things, radical ideas developed elsewhere, coming to a space in which, ruling classes, ideological hegemony hasn't consolidated yet because the whole process of capitalist development was so accelerated in time. Actually, it becomes an explosive cocktail. So the task of revolutionaries is not so much decide whether revolution is possible or not. It's to prepare for it, and also to secure its maximum possibility of success. So in that sense, UCD has no problem theoretically to explain, Rojava Revolution or Iranian Revolution or Russian Revolution as such. But at the same time, precisely because every social event is simultaneously also an international event, there is always a contextual, if you like, constraint on radical movements which occur in a particular space. And I have expressed this with respect to Rojava, that while Rojava was able to and has been able to produce this really radical practice and discourse, the expectation that somehow Rojava is able to fully realize those promises which has come out of this radical imagination would unnecessarily place a burden on that movement which it may not be able to carry forward, because in the end of the day we would likely to face the problem of socialism in one country which the Bolsheviks faced. So what do? You have seized political power, a radical movement has seized political power, and yet it's not able to actually bring it to success because it simply doesn't have the resources for it. So just like revolutionaries in Russia bet on basically success of revolution in Western Europe, in Germany in particular, and the whole theory of revolution was based for both Lenin and Trotsky that, okay, this is just a spark. We ignite revolution in Russia, and that revolution itself will ignite revolutions in Germany. And then the successful proletariat in Germany will come to our aid because they are sitting on top of a much more advanced industrial capitalist economy, which they have resources and so on and so forth. So in a way, I think Rojava Revolution or any other radical movement in Kurdistan will also at some point face the reality of objective limits to its political imagination. And that's why, there is always this, I would say, international dimension to revolutionary practices, that we all know that unless it spreads everywhere, we are suffocated over time. And one of the, I think, attractions in Öcalan's thinking when I was reading his stuff was that he's aware of it, whether it's been through, conscious reflection or just part of this system of thought he's developing, that, democratic confederalism is often thought in his work as a regional constellation, is not a specifically Kurdish thing. For it to success, you need actually to have it around you and ultimately across the world, because if capitalism is a system, and we know how good capitalism is in repairing its damages, even if you sort of break through in one part of the world, it is coming back at you, and that's why we need solidarities, but also beyond that, in terms of somehow the survival of radical change in a less developed part of the world ultimately depends on radical change in the center. Something which we haven't obviously seen, and that's in itself an interesting question as to why, the most advanced parts of the capitalist world system has been the least revolutionary in historical terms, something which goes against Marx's own sort of vision that communism is ultimately built on the most advanced fruits of capitalism. So in that sense, we should see revolution happen in the center rather than the periphery. But as I try to explain, UCD tells us that actually that is not the case. And we can explain why that's not the case, because it's not about simply, you know, the material or objective conditions in the epicenter of these events. It's much more structural, spread across the entire world system.
I suppose, and this perhaps is not the fault or the limitation of Marx himself, but I feel like there is almost an important distinction to make sometimes between Marx and Marxists, right? Which other people talk about as well. And I think so, I think sometimes the limitation of it is still seeing capitalism as primarily a economic system, but not a form or a system of modernity, which also impacts other, many parts of society and other systems. And I think that's why I think it's really important what you say around the capitalism's ability to repair itself. And I think particularly in, I guess, in the core, quote unquote, we've seen that, in the last several decades, also its ability to subsume. For example, in Britain, in the 70s, there was a big wages for housework movement, which in a way actually at the time was seen as, and I think perhaps was actually in many ways, and I think the kind of radical formation of that and still would continue to be a challenge to the system, but there was a way in which the capitalist system was able to subsume that through turning it into certain kind of fragmented services, and then obviously then later defunding them. And I think this has happened in many parts of the world. I also want to just slightly go back to what you spoke about in terms of in terms of the ability or in a way, the necessity to make life anew. And I've been thinking about recently, about the ways in which democratic modernity has been implemented and the understanding that one of the first places that on a societal level, on a I suppose, systemic level, it was implemented in a refugee camp in the north of Iraq, in Mahmur.
Mm,
And this is a camp of,
refugees.
people, thousands of people who were forced to leave their homes in the north of Kurdistan, in the southeast of Turkey, because their villages were burnt by the Turkish army and had to go at the time. Now there's a little bit more around it, right? But at the time, basically, be forced to settle in the middle of nowhere, in a refugee camp that was at the time formed and had some support by the UN. And I've been thinking about it where when you are making life anew, that's when I suppose you could make everything and nothing is possible at the same time, because you have no chance, you have no chance or no choice but to rebuild your life, your society, the world around you. And I think, you know, I think this is where like UCD I think can be very useful in also the kind of the imaginaries of people also doing this work, and of course the international systems at play and so on. And I want to continue to hear a bit more about your intellectual approach in that context or in relation to that. And for me, I think the way your work examines the Iranian Revolution, like, breaks the routine of how revolutions are understood. And, there isn't something you can, I suppose, learn off by heart and just regurgitate. It really forces one to think about things in a way, I suppose, in a calm and collected or perhaps emotionally mature manner. So yeah, I guess you also talk about the necessity of like a non-Eurocentric approach to understand revolutions as a whole, but particularly this region of the world. So I guess from like the Iranian Revolution to Mahmud, how does this play out in your thinking?
Yeah, I think one of the maybe liabilities of historical sociology in general and UCD is that it's really primarily concerned with large-scale social transformation, which means that for a lot of people who are more kind of practically involved in struggles and politics, it's often seems not concrete enough. Although, I mean, in my book, I really try to link these very general abstract ideas to the actual you know developments on the ground. But even at that level, it was still a bit general. So to address your question, I think first I want to say something about this distinction between Marx and Marxists. I was one of those people who thought for a long time that it's really the post-Marx Marxists who somehow, not necessarily consciously, but because of their circumstances in which they found themselves, I don't know, skewed Marx's ideas. But you know, I no longer think along those lines. I think there is something problematic in Marx's original ideas. And one of the attractions for me in Öcalan was that at some point he says, Marx needs revision. I don't remember the exact phrase, but he talks about Marxism in need of reform, and he sees his own interventions, intellectual intervention, as like one step in this direction. But Marx himself says in a letter that, he talks about ruthless critique of everything and a critique which does not fear its own outcome. But I think the problem of Marxists, if there is a big one, is that they never subjected Marx to historical materialism, if you like. So if ideas have always a history, so Marx would have a history himself. So I would say that, I mean, from my perspective, from UCD perspective, the main issue in Marx is that time always overwhelms space. So space doesn't have a distinct theoretical place in his theory. And it is understandable with hindsight because capital is so destructive of spatial barriers. And at some point in Grundrisse, Marx says, time annihilates space very, explicitly. And in that sense, what I call international or societal multiplicity was seen and recognized by Marx, but it was always seen as a sort of contingent condition that somehow the process of capitalist development over time brings down all these barriers, spatial differentiations between peoples, which ultimately for him actually was an expression of alienation. So race, family, state, and nation, all of these were historical product of different forms of alienation. And if you destroy, if you remove the source of alienation, which ultimately was private property for him, then all these dividing or divisive lines would ultimately disappear, and you come back to what he calls humanity as species being. So I'm working on a paper actually on how Marx's philosophical ideas in his manuscripts, 1844, if I am not wrong, begins from there, because his theory of alienation is based on, separation of human being from its species being, that you are left from, you are kind of severed from the community, and that community is humanity as a whole. And because of that, he departs, or he sort of presupposes humanity as a unified, undifferentiated whole. And that in itself removes, I don't know, theoretical significance of the fact that human history at any point has always consisted of more than one society, and that more than one condition has an effect on each and every society in that whole. So, in that sense, I think one can, um, address that issue, that problem in Marx, without obviously abandoning his wider critique of capital, especially. And I think that's really important because ultimately, Capital 3 volumes are a particular deployment of the general theory, which is historical materialism, as far as I understand Marx. So in that sense, I think there is an issue there, and I think my own often heated debates with Marxist friends and leftist friends in Kurdistan or Iran is that they somehow don't see the need to take that, seemingly very radical step that actually, if you like, um, I don't know, decolonizing Marx, although I'm writing a paper on how to decolonial theory itself. So, I mean, there is always obviously space for more critique. But back to the concrete issue, I think there is difference between radical practices in a spatial scale like Mahmur and in a larger scale like Rojava itself. And we just look at the last 6 months, we see how Rojava has adapted to certain conditions, right? So
Yeah.
to make it even more concrete, to talk to Anakasa to create what in a national unity sort of place to talk about some sort of decentralized self-governance within a state, which is obviously supposed to be not there or bypassed. What I mean is that um, there is this person. What's his first name? I can't remember his first name, but there is this Japanese American thinker, something Haratunian, who says, non-Western peoples live a comparative life, but I think every people lives a comparative life. So, in some ways, the collapse of Soviet Union was not so much about the objective poverty of the population, which, I mean, they were poor, but that was itself a comparative condition. I mean, poor in relation to what? They were looking at elsewhere or to the West, and they could see that, life can be different. So because of the way in which capitalism is able to simultaneously generate wealth, but also create um, class division, there is this simultaneous ability, the idea that I could have those things which make life easy, but I don't have it. And there is a limit to how much a radical political imagination can contain the desire to go beyond that situation on the ground, um, and sort of tap into those sources of wealth and welfare. So I'm not explaining really well, but what I mean is that I don't think something like Mahmur can be generalized at the level of state. I mean, you can generalize it, but over time there will be modification to to the ways in which life is organized and arranged. Um, Not least because the outside, which is beyond your political management, and that's what really state is about. One of my critiques of Öcalan, or my main critique of Öcalan, is that he doesn't quite take into account that state is not just the product of class or gender hierarchy. It's also a response to an outside world on which you do not have control, and you have to sort of constantly manage it. And that historically has created state-like structures, which actually Öcalan himself mentions in his account of Sumerian imperialism, which is really fascinating. But basically, his argument is that Kurds, or as ancestors of the Kurds at the time, were not of the level of development to have hierarchies which then define the state. So they were stateless communities. And yet, when they encountered Sumerian imperialist expansion, to preserve their ways of life and their community, they had to organize themselves into quite, not centralized, but regimented structures to defend themselves. So effectively, he shows how geopolitics creates state when there is no class. And I would say that you can see similar things in everywhere, actually, in Rojava itself. So the necessity to defend against ISIS, to defend against Turkey, to defend against now HTS and so on and so forth, it forces you into a particular forms of organization, which at the level of international act as states. Now, a misunderstanding which I really think is important to point out is that for a lot of people within the Kurdish freedom movement, somehow state is reduced to its modern forms of hierarchical organization based on class and gender and patriarchy and so on and so forth. I would say that this is a particular form of the state. The state, in a very generic, abstract sense, is not just this. Any form of public structures of power is state. So, in that sense, I I would say that you can have an anarchist state because it's also a particular form of distribution of power, a particular form of institutionalizing power. So state is not just about um, inequalities of access to power within a society, which then creates a structure of oppression or power. States can be internally very egalitarian, but externally they have to act as highly organized, even hierarchized. Military actually formations is an interesting example. So beyond a small band of fighters, you know, a military formation like SDF with 100,000 soldiers will have a hierarchy of chain of command and so on and so forth. So I think societies will act also, will have to act in that sense unless they are prepared to be assimilated into another state or be eradicated like the natives in the Americas. So somehow I think this conflation between state in general and modern capitalist state is something which can obscure certain dynamics which are formative of those movements. So anyway, you can interrogate me more, but I'm not sure I addressed your question that well.
No, I think that's really, really interesting to hear, and I think particularly the exploration of the development, the frameworks, and actually, I suppose even more importantly, the impacts of Marx's and Marxist thought is very, I think, very useful for our day. And I think
Yeah,
particularly as we see, um, a lot of the balances or like power balances or what people would call like geopolitical dynamics shift beyond the recognition of what Marx's analysis would be, or what, in a way, his prediction would have been of this time, whether he would have spoken about 2025 or another time, but like of an advanced capitalist time. And but I suppose what I think there is to say about some of the analysis around state is, my understanding is that there is a particular analysis of the nation state, which I think is
mm,
that particular amalgamation of the state that you're talking about as well, which or you're critiquing as well. And I think the state as, what it might look like in a way, Rojava already, I think, resembles some of the ways that you have spoken about historically peoples, nations, or societies have, developed for self-protection, self-defense, whatever
mm,
we might want to call it. And I think, looking at it, and David Graeber would talk about Rojava in this way as well, is like, the dual power structure, where the structure that almost, in a way interacts with the rest of the world does resemble the structure of a state, but that doesn't necessarily mean the same thing for the way society is organized internally. And I
yeah,
think, I think Öcalan has probably always said this, but I think in some of his latest some of his latest writings and communications has really deepened that necessary distinction between the limitations of looking at society based on class. And this is where he deepens his critique of Marx, right? And actually, we need to look at it as an issue between state and commune and not class. And I guess commune could mean many things, right? And I think perhaps it's intentional that it's about the flexibility of that as well. And I think it brings power, responsibility, accountability, and some of that into conversation and into discussion today. But I think nevertheless, I've always found the way you discuss some of these ideas like very, very illuminating and actually very
Thank you.
important. And I think sadly, it's quite, sorely absent in broad political discussion, that, the kind of like sober and necessary analysis that counters the prevalent like hacking or cracking of the system by a very simple formula, which, to be honest, for me, personally, is a lazy way of avoiding organizing, and I guess particularly political organizing, which has really drawn me a lot in recent times to some of the works of Kwame Ture, Black radical thinker who in the US, like in the civil rights movement in the US, around one, the distinction between mobilization and organization, but also actually there is no hack to the system, or there is no hacking or cracking of the system, which I think, to me, is almost a is a cryptoification of political thought, where it's like there's this one thing, and therefore we've sorted it as long as everyone gets this. So yeah, I mean, is this intentional in how you think and how you write, in trying to not only avoid but counter actively this like kind of, I guess I would call like intellectual laziness of like hacking or cracking of the system?
Yeah. Um, I mean, this reminds me of, I don't, my memory is not very great, but I'm sure you have experienced it. You come across a line which somehow just, gets sort of engraved in your mind because they are so great, at least at the time when with the kind of mind you read something. And I came across this really interesting account of the term praxis, and how contemporary Marx, well, not contemporary, but some of the Marxists, especially I would say in the third world, in the Middle East, and especially I feel that I have seen many of them in Iran or Kurdistan, and what really Marx meant. And here, obviously, I would agree with the distinction between Marx and Marxists. So Marx understood praxis as self-reflective practice. So, no, sorry. Marx thought praxis is a theoretically self-reflective practice. So you have a theory, you practice based on that, but the challenges of that practice has to reflect back on the theory with which you started. So there is always a dialectics going on. But for many leftists, praxis was theoretically informed practice. So you simply learned the theory and you went into action. And that historically gave normative precedence of action of a theory, because theory was there. You couldn't really possibly, modify Marx or whoever, Lenin, and so on and so forth. And I think this hacking also sort of relates to it, because it somehow assumes you have a way to hack, and that's it. You just have to practice it. Whereas in reality, the object of hacking, strikes back, and there's this constant battle going on, and that has to happen at the level of ideas as well. I mean, one of the I have the disadvantage of not being very practically active person, which I think affect, influences that way of practice I just described. But also at the same time, not being too active also has the advantage of, obviously, I don't know, that sober, or what, how you described it, to stand back and look at look at developments and stuff on the ground. And this goes back to the very first question. So for example, you mentioned I came from a leftist family environment, and at the time I was looking at when I was influenced by Kamala, which was at the time a self-describingly communist, Kurdish communist organization. And like many other leftist organizations, it encountered, crisis, ideological and political one, and so on and so forth. And I just couldn't, at the time, with the knowledge I had, understand where all this comes from. And what is the root? What is the root? And obviously, decades later, I could see, there was this unresolved thing in Marxism about nationalism. How you account for nationalism? Because I don't know, classical Marxists would say, "Oh, nationalism is just is a false consciousness, or is a product of the bourgeoisie to divide proletariat and so on." And either way, it shouldn't happen in Iran in 1900 or in Kurdistan in 1940, where there was no bourgeoisie, no capitalism, no industrialism. So where is this coming from? And precisely because Marxism historically seen it as an ideological sort of headache or nuisance, it's not ever seen in its own right as representing a particular social and historical dynamics. And as a result, within Komala itself, at least, it was historically always about so-called right and left wings within the party. So always the radical leftists would accuse the others as being nationalist. And interestingly, at least 5 splits have happened, and each time there is another faction who accuses the other as being nationalist. And people jokingly say in Rojhelat, what is this communist party which constantly creates nationalists? Where does this come from? And and I think at that point, for me, it's no longer a practical issue. It's not political. It's really intellectual, because unless you have an understanding, actually, even in class terms, or I don't know, materialist terms, of what nationalism is or where it comes from, you cannot simply purge it by trying to change the mentality of individuals and so on and so forth. So in that sense, for example, UCD has been very useful for me, because it shows how, how nation state itself is a particular pre-capitalist response to the pressures of capitalist development. And you mentioned Haitian Revolution. One of the episodes of that revolution, which is really fascinating, is that when the French Republic sent soldiers to repress the revolution, they encountered this slave army who chanted to them the Marseillaise, the French Revolutionary song anthem, and they were completely confused that these guys are actually singing the French Revolutionary anthem to us, and we are supposed to suppress them. Now that is by way of saying that when Iranian nation state, and by implication Turkish nation state, were forming themselves in reaction to the Western imperial pressures, the only thing they could draw on in order to create this state power was the idea of a common, I don't know, language or culture, because there was no capitalist infrastructure to sort of organically integrate these great variety of communities and peoples and so on and so forth. And because they relied on this cultural definition of the nation, by logical necessity, they had to repress diversity, because you lift up one language or one culture as the national culture and national language. And then immediately people who are not of that culture and language react to it by actually proliferating a similar discourse. So the same nationalist texts and ideas that Iranian nationalists or Turkish nationalists were drawing on to create Iranian or Turkish nation state was also available to Kurdish intellectual elite. It was not somehow they didn't have a monopoly on those ideas or on the French Revolutionary history and so on. So you see that how Kurdish intellectuals of the time also came along and said, yeah, we have a Kurdish nation which goes back to the Medes, 2000 years, and Kawa, and so on and so forth. So one form of nationalism was encountered by another. The difference being, and this is really important, which often I think anti-nationalist leftists forget, which is a distinction Lenin made. You know, the nationalism of the oppressor is not the same as the nationalism of the oppressed. But nevertheless, intellectually, it's a mirror image, you know. Because if the other side, which wants to subjugate you, draws on this idea of timeless identity based on this particular cultural language, and you are even less, economically endowed to respond with anything other than culture, then you also draw on that kind of discourse. And their here issue is not so much the reality or factuality of these ideas of nation. As you know, Anderson says, you know, nations are imagined community, but imagined doesn't mean they are inconsequential or fabricated or devoid of any significance. Actually, imagination is a very creative and proactive act. And he has this bit in the book, end of the book, I don't know you have seen it or not. He talks about why he said imagined, not imaginary, for example, because imaginary is much more about this like dreamlike thing, whereas imagined is something you actually sit down, think, and imagine it. So it's a very much more creative product. So irrespective of, you know, the level of imaginedness of these communities, once this idea is shared by a significant number of people, it's a social force. So there is no point of trying to, like, you know, ideologically diseducate nationalists or the nation, or try to change their mind about what their nation is. So long as there is objective condition that a political community has to organize itself as a community, then there is always a lot of very attentive ears to nationalist discourse, which is why it's highly unlikely that you would get rid of nationalism in Kurdish movement or anywhere. What can be done is to sort of democratize nationalist imagination by constantly bringing these critical strands, such as feminism, such as ecologic sort of consciousness, the idea that how capitalism destroys the very ecology which the nationalism is supposed to protect for its nation, and so on, how in today's world there is no national solution to environmental problems, and so on and so forth. But the very idea of a community which is bound by fate, as Otto Bauer would say, is something which I think is intrinsic to a world of multiplicity. So long as there is a collective other in relation to which you actually become conscious of your own identity, there is always some sort of discourse by which you have to understand yourself in relation to another. The problem I think historically societies face, or the challenge which radical ideas face, is to how to make the relation between self and other non-antagonistic, non-hostile. But you can never actually eradicate the difference or create a homogeneous, if you like, subject. And because you can't do that, I think it makes perfect political and intellectual sense to embrace the diversity as a condition in which you always find yourself, but try to democratize the relations between the constitutive elements of the diversity, rather than homogenize diversity, which is what unitary nation states have done. And I think that unitary is quite important, and that's something I think Öcalan regularly uses. That the problem with, one of the problems with the nation state is this singularity. It tries to turn everybody into a sort of one kind of subject, one language, one idea, one culture, and so on and so forth. And the other thing, and I would finish on this part on this, I think again in Öcalan people don't see the distinction, which I think you sort of implied as well earlier, between nation, the nation state, and the state. And my reading of Öcalan, for example, is that he does not, I don't know, reject or wants to abolish the nation as such. And the very idea of democratic nation already assumes nation. So it's about a particular kind of nation, not the nation per se. So I think some of the major problems within the Kurdish movement between what is described as nationalist and, I don't know, socialist tendencies is partly could have been avoided if there was a deeper reflection on both nationalist theory to show them that actually nation is not timeless and ancient, it's a modern phenomenon, and the socialist tendency which sees nation or national division as something which is entirely a product of capitalism, which is simply not true, because even before capitalism the world was divided into countless societies. So it may not have been called nation, tribe, I don't know, empires and so on, but nonetheless, the world has always been consisting of multiple collectivities, irrespective of what we call them. So the really issue is the internal structure of those collectivities, which, as you mentioned, can be democratic, but their external posture often takes a state-like form. And we should not just avoid it or wish it away. That's something which is something beyond our each collective's individual agency. There is more than one collectivity, and therefore within that context you are just one particularity among many. And so how you relate to that environment is become really crucial.
Yeah, and I see what you've just said as also a strong advocate or advocating quite strongly for against the kind of sometimes what we see, the isolationism within
Mhm. Yeah.
certain nations. I think, for example, we've heard this a lot through some of the sayings that have become prevalent in the last decade or so within I suppose Kurdish, I would call it mostly communications rather than Kurdish thought, which is, we have no friends but the mountains. And
Mm.
on one level, I get what that may mean in a, well-meaning analysis, but I think often, sadly, what it not only implies but also encourages is this isolationism, which, I think makes that external, I guess, perhaps necessary posturing, a bit more rigid, and therefore, I think it encourages for that external posturing to also be implemented internally as well. And I think also to go beyond what you said around, one, obviously in some of Lenin's thought, but also obviously others have developed this in terms of nationalism of the oppressed and nationalism of the oppressor. I think often what is also referred to as nationalism, for example, when we speak about it in English, is discussed in different ways in Kurdish as well, right? Like, for example, patriotism has a very different word in Kurdish, like
Yeah,
Velat
yeah,
Parezi really does not mean what patriotism means in terms of one, its linguistic root, but also its history, its impacts, and its socialization. So
yeah.
I think in a way that also brings in some of the work that you talk about and that you've been doing for a while around the importance of looking at or critiquing Eurocentrism, whether that's literally language or obviously other forms of it, and obviously at looking at non-Western colonialism as well, because again, for the last few decades, a lot of Kurdish thinkers, Kurdish intellectuals have also spoken, whether it's particularly, this has particularly been discussed in the case of Turkey, but I think probably also applies to Iran as well, is, actually in Turkey, there isn't a Kurdish question, there's a Turkish question. And what that implies is that there is a necessity for Turkish, well, firstly, the political system, I suppose, but also Turkish society to transform to be able to live with its neighbors, and so on. So I think for me, I think all of that is really important. And I wanted to hear what you thought about that. And also, I see it a bit related as well. When we're critiquing Eurocentrism, particularly in the framing or in the analysis of non-Western colonialism, particularly being in the West, I feel like there's also another responsibility of doing it from the West, right? Of talking about non-Western colonialism when, in many ways, Western colonialism, in terms of its power and its ability, actually, in a way, also, as you said, in terms of the formations of the Turkish and Iranian nation state, has its very, very insidious histories. So, yeah, I wanted to hear a bit more about what you
Yeah,
also think about that responsibility.
absolutely. I mean, my current work on Western colonialism draws on earlier thought on limits of post-colonial critique of Eurocentrism, because the argument I'm working on or developing is that post-colonial critique as one of the, I mean, probably the most powerful critique of Eurocentrism, has somehow been dazzled by looking too much into the eyes of the beast, so much so that it has lost sight of similar practices, which is done by non-Western states or agencies. And more specifically, colonialism and post-colonialism is so narrowly defined around classical Western colonialism that bringing in non-Western forms of colonialism somehow I mean, post-colonialists, I would say, perceive that as undermining their case against Western colonialism. Um, you know, it's almost like a courtroom. You indict West for its colonialism, and if someone comes along, the defense says, "Well, sorry, but there are other forms of colonialisms as well." Somehow you see that as diluting your indictment, and so you're trying just not to see it or hear it and neglect it. And my own argument is that colonial practices can be different in terms of scale. Definitely, Western classical forms of Western colonialism is probably unique, but in terms of the substance of colonial practices, which is ultimately about denial of self-determination, extraction, exploitation, assimilation, and so on and so forth. These are done by all of these modern nation states, So what I'm advocating is a definition of colonialism which is about the social and historical substance of it rather than geographical origins. And that, in that sense, what China does in Tibet, or I don't know, Russia does in Ukraine, or Turkey does in Kurdistan, and Britain did in India, or France did in Algeria, they become different instances and arguably of different scales of very similar practices that you want to subjugate the other ultimately. or assimilated. Obviously, I'm simplifying, but what I'm trying to say is that um, that yes, the responsibility. I mean, how to put it? I can see that it's difficult. I mean, Western leftist intellectuals might find it awkward to call a non-Western state as colonialists, because in the current geopolitical environment, that could be easily um, used by Western imperialism to sort of, advance its projects and so on and so forth. But I'm not sure how correct is that. And I had a personal encounter with, during the height of Syrian civil war and ISIS and so on, and Turkish support for ISIS at the time. And I was asking, quite critical leftist post-colonial friends and colleagues why you are not talking about barrel bombs of Assad's, or I don't know, what Turkey does to Kurdistan and so on. And they were quite, I mean, at least one of them was very explicit that, well, I have to deal with what my own state does to others. So Western, British, I don't know, American responsibility and actions is my primary sort of duty. And there was this implication that, okay, dealing with Turkish and Iranian, whatever colonialism, falls on the shoulder of Iranians and the Kurds and so on. And I'm not sure that's entirely correct, but I could see where they come from, because they don't want to be, to be somehow implicitly recruit their work to be misappropriated by Western imperialism and so on and so forth. But I think before all of these political sort of interventions, we need to change our lenses as well. And I just don't see any substantive difference between what Turkey has done in Kurdistan than what French were doing in Algeria to some extent. Um, and very interestingly, I came across this book recently about, um, it's called Ataturk in Nazi Imagination. And this historian, who's a German actually, he documents extensively, like several hundred pages, that Armenian genocide and what the Turkish Republic did with the various uprisings in Kurdistan were actually inspiring Nazi ideologues who then went on to design Holocaust. So this whole notion that somehow Holocaust was, as Arendt would put it, colonialism coming home, i.e. Western colonialism being practiced at home, is not entirely true. Actually, non-Western um, elites and rising states were practicing the kind of industrial scale violence which actually inspired some of the worst excesses of Western, fascism in Europe and so on and so forth. So what I am trying to do is to actually look at the intellectual origin of this dualism, that somehow, post-colonial critique is look at the West and the non-West, and the hierarchies within each of them is sort of neglected. Because as we know, and everybody talks about, the West has never been internally, obviously, either coherent or united, two world wars and all that. But the same thing applies to the non-West. And just to give a new example, and when anti-colonial movements in the early 20th century, mid-20th centuries were fighting Western colonialism, their actually conception of the nation on behalf of which they were fighting Western colonialism already was imposing certain uniformity to the so-called nation, which became the ideological basis on which then those extremely violent state formation took place. So Mahmoud Mamdani quotes this really incredible scene that, when you went, I think, is it Tanzania or Uganda after independence, there is this huge banner at the entry to the capital city. It says, "For the nation to rise, tribe must die." And this was the blueprint for each and every nation formation in third world, in Iran, in Turkey, in Iraq, everywhere. So you define um, those communities which do not speak the language of the nation, which you have also chosen by force, define them as backward tribes or whatever communities, and then civilize them from the center, which is exactly what the French thought they were doing in Algeria. So each of these modern nation states became kind of mini colonial, Western colonial powers internally, in relation to which and against which then you have this series of nationalist backlash from those communities. So there is a chain of causality all across these historical and geographical places between the rise of capitalism, intersection with geopolitics, rise of state formation, modern states, and how they were built upon uniformity, cultural and linguistic internally, which involved massive amount of violence, against which then you have this, a various form of national resistance, which appropriates the same language often of the nationalist oppressors. So yeah, there has to be a rethinking of these intellectual and political responsibilities within, both within our countries, but also, West Europe and the non-Western intellectuals and activists and so on.
I think I've often thought about the, and I wonder if what you would have to say about this in terms of, you know, when we talk about the non-Western colonialism, it's not really, let's call it like getting any like airtime. Um, there's a particularity when it comes to Turkey, but I also think Iran. And I think the reason why I think particularly Turkey is because despite it being a NATO member, despite it being having the second largest NATO army, having one of the largest NATO bases on its soil, it's still can see that like even though I don't agree,
Yeah,
there is a framing in which I can understand why Iran is seen in that way, particularly in the last few decades, right? I think for me it's even more peculiar when it comes to the question of Turkey and particularly what you spoke about in terms of Atatürk and the Nazi imagination. You know, Hitler is quoted to say Mussolini and I are great students of Atatürk. So
yeah.
even with this history, there's for some reason
Reluctance,
it's
yeah.
yeah, there is just it's not I feel like it's not it doesn't even get to the stage of like reluctance. It's just even there's no drive to even engage with it or explore it in any way. And I always think I've thought about in the last several years around the Kurdish question or the broader Kurdish movement in broad anti-colonial thought of our day, and have thought about is it to do with particularly the Kurdish freedom movements era of coming of age, where it was, it was kind of, the post-Soviet, post-Cold War, post-colonial, so the post or the
Mm.
post-colonial struggle dynamics. I've thought about, what that is, that for some reason, in terms of broad international anti-colonial thought, Kurdistan hasn't taken its place. And in a way, I think it's had its advantages, where there's been a opportunity to really develop certain ideas of how one could envisage society. But obviously, it's had its limitations of challenges and challenges around, I guess, on a very simple case, on a very simple sense, recognition or like awareness about it. And I was reading a bit about the kind of the history of Kurdish diplomacy, and there was even delegations in support of people in like some of the tribes in Yemen's like anti-Ottoman organizing or sentiments or struggle
Mm.
in the late 19th, early 20th century. And so there was an era where there was like a particularly Kurdish political formations when arguably it was like less powerful, it was less
Mm.
effective, was more integrated, particularly into the region, but something shifted, particularly in the 20th century. So yeah, I wanted to hear your thoughts
Yeah.
about all of
I
that.
mean, yeah, there is so much to say about this, but I think, you know, the political geography of the world being, you know, built upon nation state was somehow solidified by the end of Second World War. And even at the First World War, in the aftermath of which obviously we have the Sèvres Treaty and the Lausanne in terms of Kurdistan, but also, the disintegration of the um, Habsburg Empire and the Ottoman and so on. Even from then, there was this notion that uh, the the Western imperialism, but especially the US, because it was just coming into the scene, much more powerful and rich and strong compared to British and the French, who were exhausted by then. It was all seen that this whole idea of national self-determination and creating different nation states, or helping them to create different nation states, was was an imperial actually ploy. It was to divide larger units into smaller ones, which were then would be much more easy to deal with. And in a strange way, this obsession with larger political units is somehow stayed with the leftists, because which is on the one of the grounds on which they would oppose, for example, I don't know, Kurdish movement for national self-determination in a place like Iran or Turkey, is that, well, first of all, this means secession. Secession means smaller units, and that means that Western imperialism is much more easily can dominate these small states, smaller states, and that would be, detrimental to the long-term project of a socialist revolution and so on. But there was also a slightly more intellectual argument, which is, if you look at the classical linear theory of history, which many Marxists obviously adopted, which is now, feudalism, capitalism, socialism. So to have socialist revolution, you need capitalist development, which would then lead to development of working class, and working class becomes a subject of the next revolution towards socialism. So in that sense, anything which would facilitate or accelerate capitalist development would be a good thing, which is why, um, leftist forces often sided with what they perceive to be national bourgeoisie against Western imperialism. Which, by the way, is also why, for example, Turkish communists were very appreciative of Ataturk, because he was seen as this anti-imperial leader who's basically laying the ground, irrespective of what he thinks or says, for the socialist revolution. So this and capitalist development requires a home market and a national economy, and the larger that will be, the more likely it will succeed into capitalist industrialization, and therefore it will bring us closer to socialism. So you see that there is a preference for larger political units built into actually a lot of socialist thinking. I mean, the most remarkable example is actually Rosa Luxemburg, who, openly opposes Polish nationalists on the ground that, ultimately they are just dividing a larger unit, which means, I don't remember her exact words, but basically only the language of the capitalist oppressors changes, but it's the same thing. But also because the likelihood of capitalist development in a smaller national economy is less, and therefore the likelihood of socialist revolution is less. So there is all these things about larger units, how you position yourself in relation to Western imperialism, and anyone against it somehow becomes progressive, which is what Iran has become after revolution. But as you say, well, that argument at least doesn't work for Turkey. So why not about Turkey? Anyway, in my own thinking, I have tried to take kind of note of the fact that non-Western colonialist states or powers have they occupy this quite paradoxical space in relation to their internal subjects of colonialism. They are obviously acting as dominant oppressors of colonial powers, but in international order they occupy a subaltern place. Iran in relation to the West or United States is a subaltern state in the sense of it's a weak state. It's subjected to intervention, coups, I don't know, sanctions, and so on and so forth. So we have to be, I mean, analytically, we have to make sure that we understand that these states have two faces. Internally facing, they act pretty much colonially, but externally, they themselves are subject to hierarchies of power. So I have come up with this notion I have a short paper on it, which I call, it's called inter-subaltern colonialism. So a colonialism which is practiced by a force which is itself subaltern in international level, but it's colonial in the domestic level. And that should, I don't know, I thought that's important. I thought I preferred it to internal colonialism, which is much more widely used by a lot of people. But I think internal colonialism is very descriptive. It doesn't say anything about why it is happening, and the geopolitical identity of the subject of this colonialism. But I think inter-subaltern colonialism signals these sort of this ambivalent position or that these states occupy simultaneously within a global hierarchy of power, within which they could be seen as subaltern states. They are trying to go up the ladder, if you like, but internally they rely on colonial practices, which paradoxically is supposed to bolster their position internationally so that they become less subalternized internationally. So there is it's a weird dialectic that international struggle for equality rests on internal oppression of subaltern nations or subaltern peoples.
I mean, I think a really important and actually very insidious example of that is in the last few years, the UAE. The
Yeah,
UAE's role in particularly in the
Africa,
last
yeah.
few years yeah, I mean, across Africa, but particularly in Sudan at the moment, and its clear ambitions, on the international stage, I think is a very important example of like the inter-subaltern colonialism, but also like internally as well. It's a country built on slave economy,
Yeah.
and it almost sees it as that, or has convinced also its people that that is necessary for them to perhaps climb up the ladder
Yeah.
in some ways. And so I think that's really interesting. Now, obviously, we could talk for hours and hours,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. We have to
um,
finish it.
I wanted to ask, I guess, a final area of questions, which is we've obviously spoken about it quite a lot, but specifically about the developments or the what we see in all four parts of Kurdistan. And it's been a big decade for Kurdistan, from like Bakur and the HDP, and obviously now as the Dem Party, to Rojava, to the developments in Bashur, and obviously to Rojalat with the many people have called the Zinjan Azadi revolution following the brutal murder of Gina Amini. And you know and it seems like the kind of developments or the role that Kurdistan is holding in the region, and perhaps even in some ways in the behind the scenes globally in terms of balances, is not going to go away anytime soon. So I wanted to ask how you analyze the current conjuncture, not necessarily from like a current news perspective, but in terms of the possibilities that may be arising in what seems to be a shifting region and a shifting world. Obviously, the past 10 years has been very significant. It seems to be, I guess, arguably getting more significant with a process between the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, and the Turkish state. A process that yet doesn't have a formal name, but I suppose for the argument we could call a peace process. Yeah, how, and after, I guess, over a decade of engagement, like different Kurdish forces or political formations have had with what you've also called uneasy bedfellows. Where could we see all of this going? Can we actually analyze it as a more, I guess, can we see it as a bit more of a unified analysis for all parts of Kurdistan, or is it at this point quite necessary to approach each part separately?
Well, I think each part has particular features and dynamics, which has to do with the fact that each wing of Kurdish movement struggles against a particular nation state, which itself has a particular political economy and particular international positionality. I think Iran and Turkey is a good example. One is in the anti-Western sort of quite revisionist state in that sense, which has been at the receiving end of Western imperial sort of pressures and so on. On the other hand, you have Turkey, which second largest army of NATO, and so on and so forth. But and that this means that each strands of Kurdish movement, even discursively, have developed differently. But I would say I think two main things. One is that Kurdistan's geographical and geopolitical division has simultaneously been a limitation, if not a curse, but also an advantage. Because, I mean, limitation because in the absence of modern resources of state power, Kurdish movements have always found themselves in a position in which they can resist, but they cannot win a military or guerrilla warfare against a highly powerful and resourced state. On the other hand, because Kurdistan is divided and each part has its own particular dynamics, particular class composition, if you like, ideological sort of discourses and so on, and each of which tend to find themselves in opportune moments at different times. Mahabad in Republic in 1946, Iraq in 91 when the first Gulf War allowed for the formation of KRG, Syrian civil war in 2011-12, which allowed for the rise of AANES, Rojava administration. This lack of synchrony historically and uneven development regionally means that developments in each part can have immediate and strategic implications for movement in other parts. And I think that's what we are witnessing, really. In some ways, the current desperate attempts by Turkish state to influence developments in Syria and Rojava would have been very different if there was no so-called peace process. And it would be even more different if there was no 7th of October and therefore Israeli interventionism in the region. So there is this really, what I would say the big picture is that the post-First World War state formation projects were always based upon very shaky grounds, but Cold War gave them a lease of life. And I think what we are witnessing is a new round of state formation, not in the sense of new states emerging necessarily, but in the sense of a very radical restructuring of these states, And this is partly because of wider geopolitical dynamics, which is beyond the will of each of these states, let alone each of the Kurdish movement within them. So I think Syria is a really good example in the sense that how the this geopolitical confrontation between Israel and Iran following 7th of October is bound to create a space in which Rojava can exploit it geopolitically, and I think it would be strategically unwise if they didn't. This does not mean, entering into formal alliance with genocidal state like Israel, but it means that whether you like it or not, Israel is seeking to secure a safe space, at least in part of Syria, in order to deal with Iran long term. So unless something dramatically changes in Iran and you have a pro-Western, Israel-friendly state in power, Israel is bound to 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 seek to sort of have a free hand in Syria, at least in the southern part to some extent. And for that reason, it would oppose any attempt to recreate a centralized, powerful state, which would then limit its ability for maneuvering. And I think that's what really frightens Turkey, and it's trying to sort of push Jolani government into a much more confrontational politics towards Rojava. But I'm not sure they can actually directly intervene, because that would jeopardize so much and risks in confronting Israel itself. So situation in Iran is extremely dire, and it's pregnant with radical change. I would imagine radical in terms of the status quo cannot continue, and I just don't see how Islamic Republic can survive without either changing itself beyond recognizability as the Islamic Republic, or just some sort of collapse. And in which case, then we would have a situation in which Rojava could re-emerge or emerge as a new Rojava. And by then you would have a situation in which you have, some sort of Kurdish political structures in three parts of Kurdistan at least. And this itself will have, insurmountable implications for Bakur and Kurdistan in longer run. So I think the situation is very fluid. There is a lot of space for Kurdish movement to exploit this otherwise geopolitical competition between states which have no empathy or sympathy for the Kurds, but they are just doing stuff which inadvertently helps Kurdish movement. So we need, I think, Kurdish movement needs a much more strategic vision and a sort of a transnational, regional sort of strategy without giving up, or I don't know, significantly changing the particular local space in which each branch of the movement or each party operates. And we see this to some extent in the peace process, so-called peace process itself. And what I see is that the PKK is really sort of not only trying to change tack because of changed circumstances, but also allowing actually Rojava's survival to be secured uh, by kind of modifying its strategy vis-a-vis Turkey. And we already see how this process has made it more difficult for Turkey to directly intervene in Rojava. So I hope we see more of this strategic and broader sort of thinking within the Kurdish movement. And as I often say in different contexts that international relations is as many international scholars, at least the classical ones, would say, international space is the space of survival, whereas domestic contexts are where you strive for good life. And these are very different spaces, which is why, that strange bedfellow metaphor you used, I don't think something we should be uncomfortable about. I think this is the nature of international politics, that actors who have nothing ideologically in common might tactically, under particular circumstances, have interests which converges. The point is not to give up on your radical project because of these tactical alliances, which I think is Rojava has been trying to do, that while American forces are on the ground, but it doesn't mean that they would give up on their communalism or, I don't know, feminist aspirations and so on and so forth. So yeah, there is a lot of possibilities, but of course we can never predict what happens. But yeah, the Kurdish movement has come a long way. I think it's very difficult to see any international actor or global actor not to take into account the Kurdish movement. But in the end, we cannot just bet on international actors, and the Kurdish movement needs to build up its own strength from within, uh, and prepare for changes which are happening beyond its will. It should try not to be surprised. And I think, when I look at Iran and I look at the quite sorry state of Kurdish parties, it's a very fragmented at the moment. And everybody knows that Iran is pregnant with change. So it's a simple thing that, we have to, for the time being, have a minimal program around which they can unite. And then once things happen, then they can intervene as a kind of decisive force.
Thank you very much, Kamran. And just finally, what do you think needs to happen, or what do you think we need to see next for an important positive direction in this so-called peace process?
I had an interview with Stack TV recently. Maybe I can say that in English in a slightly rephrased way. One thing I'm a little bit uncomfortable with is that I totally understand, and I would probably even support the change of tactic in the movement, given the circumstances. But I would caution against discursive and ideological justification for that change in a way that it dilutes the strategic significance of Kurdish question. I think by just saying it's a Turkish question, that's an important point to be made, but it's also it can distract from the specificity of the Kurdish condition in a place like Turkey. So that's, I think, at the level of discursiveness. So, and I would ideological discourse. So one can say, look, in the era of drones, there is a limit on guerrilla struggle. One can say that from the denial of Kurdish existence, we have reached a point that it's no longer denied, and of course that requires some sort of adaptation in the struggle. But I wouldn't advocate a line in which it distracts from the specificity of especially colonial circumstances imposed on the Kurds, and I wouldn't think that Kurdish question is just a matter of democratization of Turkish state, because that's what Turkish left has been saying for decades. Yeah, so socialism in Turkey will solve the Kurdish question. So why are you guys going for your own struggle? And I think these are kind of different things. The second, I think, thing I would say, which is much more specific, I think, and I don't think they need to hear from me, but I think DEM Party or whoever are in this process, they would know it 1,000 times more than me about the strengths of the cards they're holding, because AKP and Erdogan cannot really achieve what they want to do without implicit or de facto or tacit support of their party in the parliament. And I don't think they should or they could even, underplay their hand. I think they are in a strong position despite what might look. And on top of that, we have Rojava. So Erdogan cannot intervene in Rojava militarily the way he did in Afrin or in, Grispi and so on now, without jeopardizing all the stuff he wants to do internally in Turkey, because it would lose Kurdish vote in a constitutional election, referendum, or in a future presidential election and so on. So they are very constrained actually with respect to Rojava, but also constrained internally. Now they speak as if they are in a dominant position, but I think that's not quite true. So it's a really matter of a maturity and measured way in which Kurdish movement in Turkey has to deal with this process, and how in this opening space a discourse which would progressively eat into the dominant Turkish nationalist discourse should enter. And I'm not advocating for an immediate step like the one I'm going to say, but in Rojava, autonomous administration, Ilham Ahmed and others, Mazlum Abdi have said, why Syrian Arab Republic? This republic is not Arab. There are all sorts of communities within it. So why not just Syrian Republic or Democratic Syrian Republic? And I think something like this could be said about Turkey. Why Turkey? I mean, if it's a democratic state or democratic formation, why one collective identity has to define the state? So I think both symbolically and discursively, that would mean a real step forward if this was actually even discussed, within Turkish politics. Now, I'm not there, and I really don't claim to know Turkish politics that well, and I trust Kurdish movement there. But obviously, the more views on the table, the better for any movement to draw on. So that's basically two, I would say, strategic and discursive thing I would say about the process.
Thank you very much, Cameron. Thank you for your time and your thinking and for your continued work.
My
It was a
pleasure.
really important discussion. Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Thanks very much.